You're listening to an event from the U.S. Institute of Peace, part of the USIP podcast network. For more information about our work around the world, visit usip.org and check us out on social media.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. I'm Sasha Pippenger. I direct the Peace Processes team here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. On behalf of the Institute and also the PeaceCon organizers more broadly, I'd like to welcome you, both those who are here with us in the room, thank you for coming, and also those that are joining us on the live stream. Today's topic on emergent mediation powers is close to our hearts here at USIP. Our Peace Processes team has spent the last year looking closely at the intersection between geopolitics and mediation. And our working thesis, which is not original and is shared by many, is that we are in a moment where the era of UN-led and Western-led mediation is slowly coming to a close. And that the center of gravity for international mediation is shifting away from the West and towards a new set of mediation powers, among them Qatar, Oman, Turkey, South Africa, and others. And I should say here, this isn't to say that any of these countries I just mentioned are new to mediation. They certainly are not. When we use the term emerging mediation powers, we're referring to the fact that the space and status that these actors occupy in the mediation landscape is growing in relation to traditional Western mediation powers. So in practical terms, what does this look like? We think in the coming decade, we're going to see fewer and fewer UN-led processes, and it's going to become increasingly less common to see lead mediators from Norway, Switzerland, Finland. And frankly, this take that we have is not at all groundbreaking, and the evidence of it is absolutely everywhere, right? Just this past year, we see Turkey playing a key mediation role in facilitating a prisoner swap between the US, Russia, and several European states. We, of course, have Qatar that has been busily working towards trying to mediate an end to the conflict in Gaza. We have Angola that's been mediating between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda to address the fighting in the eastern DRC. We have Saudi Arabia and the United States that are partnering up together to try and build a process that could bring an end to the fighting in Sudan. And we have Oman facilitating a channel between Iran and the US on release of detainees, among other things. Perhaps, though, the most conspicuous example of all of them is the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. 10, 20 years ago, when many of us got into this field, you would expect to normally see the political arm of the UN appoint a high-level envoy that would play a key role in ushering the parties towards, ideally, a negotiated end to the conflict, but even just a termination of hostilities. And instead, what do we see? The political arm of the UN is very missing in action. And instead, the mediation that has occurred is essentially in piecemeal deals that are issue-specific, whether on prisoners, return of children, the grain deal. And they're led by separate countries, Qatar, UAE, and Turkey. Pardon me. One of the most interesting things to observe about this shift is the fact that all of those subtracks of the Ukraine negotiations that are happening are addressing the ongoing impacts of the crisis rather than the drivers or the potential resolution of it. So on a macro level, this shift raises all sorts of questions for the broader mediation field, and particularly for those of us that are working on track one peace processes. For example, as the mediators change, unsurprisingly, so do the mediation practices. And what does this mean for all of us that are active in this mediation ecosystem? Moreover, we have a question about whether we need to revisit some of the definitions we've been using in this field, the distinctions between mediation, facilitation, negotiation, diplomacy, power brokering. We're seeing a lot of blurring in the lines between these concepts, and we're starting to ask ourselves, are the definitional distinctions that we came up with 30 years ago for use in this field really actually serving our current reality as we see it in international mediation? And then, of course, we have the big question, which is in conflicts like Ukraine, where we see multiple subtracks going on, should we, and if so, how, do we coordinate those efforts in the absence of a UN body or a large multilateral body like the UN taking leadership over that? So in pursuit of answers to these questions, my team and I over the past year have been doing a bit of a world tour to South Africa, Oman, Qatar, India, and we'll be in Turkey in a couple of months. And we've been speaking to government officials and mediators and those that are really on the front line of this new era of mediation initiatives. And the good news for everyone here today is that we managed to convince some of the most insightful people that we met along our journeys to join us for this discussion today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our esteemed panel. To my left, we have Dr. Andrea Prah, who has traveled here from South Africa to be with us today, where she's a senior researcher based at the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, also known to many of you as ACCORD. She's the managing editor of the African Journal on Conflict Resolution and a strategy group member of the African Union Political Affairs Peace and Security Commission's network of think tanks for peace. To her left, we have Dr. Nimet Beriker. She's a lecturer at the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution program at Columbia University. Previously, she was a global fellow at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo and was the founding faculty member and the coordinator of Sabancı University's graduate program on conflict analysis and resolution in Istanbul, Turkey. Nimet also provided advisory services to the International Academic Advisory Council for the Mediation Initiative at the UN Department of Political Affairs, as well as at the OSCE Mediterranean Contact Group and Turkey's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Then finally, to her left, we have my colleague, Cecily Brewer. She recently joined our Peace Processes team as a senior expert focused on mediation. Previously, she served as Vice President Kamala Harris's Foreign Policy Advisor on Africa. In her 15 years with the US government, she's focused on international conflict and negotiation, strategic planning, including at the State Department policy planning staff, as well as Africa policy. She has also worked for 4 US special envoys and representatives and was part of the US team supporting negotiations between Sudan and South Sudan. And then finally, we have our colleague coming to us live from Muscat, Oman, Youssef Al-Balushi. Youssef is a visiting fellow at the Modern College of Science and Business in Muscat. He's working in the domains of economics and political economy. He's also engaged with several international think tanks, specializing in regional security and GCC international relations, with a particular focus on Yemen, Iraq, and Iran. And of course, on Oman in particular, Youssef is a prominent researcher and commentator on topics related to the evolution of Oman's geopolitical significance and foreign policy. So how we're going to go about this afternoon is we are going to start by passing off to each of our panelists to give a brief set of opening remarks. I'll ask the panelists to limit themselves to 5 minutes, and if they venture far past that threshold, I will start to give them meaningful eye contact. And we'd like to start off first with Youssef. Over to you, Youssef.
So I think it's a good afternoon at your time. It's a good evening here. So hi, Sasha. It's very nice to see you virtually. And first of all, I really do appreciate the U.S. Institute of Peace to giving me the chance to speak in this very interesting panel, which is discussing a very timely topic, especially emerging, the new emerging mediators globally. I mean, maybe I would like to start with giving a bit of highlights that, first of all, obviously we can see that, or we have to admit that the number of conflicts globally is really rising. And what we were witnessing, I mean, in 2010, there were across the globe, there were somewhere around 30 conflicts or armed conflicts. Nowadays, we crossed more than 85 armed conflicts globally. So that's a very important trend we need to look at, where the conflict numbers are really rising, especially the armed conflict and violence conflict. The nature of these conflicts and the nature of the new types of conflicts, those conflicts which really raised are really diverse between multi-layers conflicts, ideological conflicts, reaching to the point of state, non-state actor conflicts. And it's not only the conflicts which are limited to a certain geographical location, it's really than that, and the conflicts applications are really getting all over across the globe. And therefore, I think the interest toward mediation, facilitation, negotiation, all of these words become more and more relevant. But interestingly, we started seeing the appetite for different parties to be part of the mediation sphere, with all the definition on that is really ramping up. So the knowledge and the talks about mediation are getting more and more. The skills which are left up in these spheres are as well are getting, are raising day after day. But unfortunately, from the other side, the conflicts which are solved are getting less and less. So we are really witnessing a very interesting trend where more appetite to mediate the conflict, less results we are facing. And that's really opening a real question to us. Are we tackling the conflict, or the framework of mediation is relevant still, or we need really to look at this framework and try to think something which really take in count all of these new realities in the conflict and the conflict resolution. From there, I would like really to start, dive in to understand, I'll give a bit of, understanding, or at least why this highly appetite is coming toward mediation, because I think there are a lot are seeing the mediation are not just being as a conflict resolution tool, but as well it's being as a reputation, political reputation to the countries which are taking this role, and some of them are taking it as a security measure to their own security, especially for the smaller states and smaller powers. From there, maybe if I'll speak about Oman's model of facilitation, which is called as well mediation. I think we are in Oman, we are very clear about our role, where we do work on facilitating and trying to get different conflicting parties across any conflict which we are trying to negotiate in. So we don't go to the mediation, and I think in our definition, the main difference we are really relying on, that there are three elements which differentiate between what is called mediation, and what's called facilitation, which is the first one. We don't design the negotiation table at all, so we don't decide who should be at that table and who shouldn't. We think that's a call of the different conflicting parties to decide how they want to come to that table and when they have to come to that table, and we have to be really flexible in allowing, the dialogue to kick in. The second thing, we do make sure that in Oman that we don't be part of any of these discussions. We do provide any support whenever it's needed, but it is like leaving the room and letting different parties to discuss, to make sure that we will not be polarized to any part while the discussions are ongoing. And the third thing, I think, which we are relating to, which is we are trying to make sure not to set the targets toward any specific outcomes before the negotiations start. We think to get really open toward this negotiation and to see whatever compromises will happen and whatever deal will be concluded to. And I think in that, as Sasha mentioned, we're considered as emerging mediators or facilitators, but still we have a good history in that. And I think we try to work on promoting peace in different ways, either through conflict resolution or mediation, through decades. So it's not overnight work. And I think that's really allowed us in Oman to enable this role due to several reasons, not limited to one. Our geographical location, which is really, out of all the choke points in the Arabian Peninsula, having Iran next to us and having all our brothers in the Gulf and being in the middle between Asia and Africa, that really allowed us two things. One, to be really in a very hot zone where there is good number of conflicts rising, but the second thing, it is really to start looking at the peace and prosperity as one of the arc of our own development in Oman. That's which is really allowing us to try to mediate as much conflict as we can. I think one of the biggest success we worked in, it was the GCPOA. We contributed to that, between US and Iran, but as well, I think Yemen, it's one of the current conflicts we're trying to sort out, providing a lot of as well prisoner exchange between the West and Iran. So all of these files we are trying to really work on de-escalating as much as we can. The last point I want to mention before I stop here, because I think maybe I'm passing my 5 minutes. All of this good work are not coming for free. Always there is a risk of mediation or facilitation, and especially the smaller powers are less able to work with these risks. And one of the risks is really the backlash and the bad images or the bad reputation anyone will have during that. And this is something we might hear about here in Oman, about Oman sometimes, where Oman is maybe biased with X or with Y in certain conflicts. And we are witnessing that as well. With Qatar these days, we are witnessing that with different mediators. So I think that's the cost which we recognize and we are willing to pay, because we think that the outcome from the peace is much higher than this risk. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Youssef. And I think your comments really underscore one of the topics we were hoping to unpack today, which is by hearing Omani philosophy on an international mediation process, it really brings to the surface this question of where does mediation turn into facilitation, turn into foreign policy? And Oman really has a distinctive approach to that. I'll turn now to Andrea.
Thank you very much, Sasha, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be joining you here from South Africa. And thank you to the organizers for bringing us together, and happy to be part of this esteemed panel. Before I start, I'd just like to disclose that any comments I make today are not a reflection of Accord's position, nor are they a reflection of the South African government's position. So I'm talking with a sort of researcher's hat, very far away from home. I think that thus far we've really had a good impression of the conflict landscape globally, and I'd like to just bring it closer to home on the African continent, where not only are we seeing a rise in conflict, but we're seeing a rise or an increased number of options in how we want to manage the conflict. So, for example, we're seeing, a very publicized activities of private military security companies, specifically in the Sahel. We're also seeing ad hoc security initiatives or peace enforcement missions that either come from within the regional economic communities themselves, like we saw with Southern Africa in Mozambique, northern Mozambique, or from sort of previously dormant regional organizations that are now taking a more active role in conflict management. So, I mean, one might refer to this as, or might say that parties to a conflict now have various options. We might call this like forum shopping. And in this context, what is the role of mediation? So, yes, certainly a very timely discussion for us on the continent as well. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrea. And I think that brings another key point that we've been thinking about here, which is if we see the leadership on mediation move away from the UN, I think 10 years ago we thought that it would move away from the UN to regional and sub-regional multilateral organizations. And that's, I dare say, been more true on the African continent than anywhere else in the world. But what role does that leave for state mediators, and do we think state mediators will increasingly be taking up those roles, perhaps at the expense or moving into a space that we thought would be occupied by sub-regional organizations? I'll pass now to Nimet.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be part of this panel, and thank you for the invitation. I want to say a few words about how mediation became part and parcel of Turkish foreign policy execution. I would like to talk a little bit on the, how this became so visible, so institutionalized. So it will take me back to early 2000s. And by the way, I should note that sometimes I will refer to Turkey's mediation. Sometimes I will refer to AK Party's, Justice and Development Party's mediation, because this particular activity overlaps with the rule of this particular political party who is ruling Turkey more than 22 years now. That is, I hope it will not create any confusion. So this mediation, as I said before, it became more and more visible during the AK Party rule. They came to power in early 2000. That also overlapped with when we started a conflict resolution program in Istanbul, as Sasha mentioned. I should say the institutionalization of this engagement was, one of the reasons of it was a very active collaboration between academia and the practice world. Because we were able to create a critical mass in Istanbul with the help of our colleagues from Turkey, international colleagues, and our brilliant graduate students. So we were able to write, talk, publish policy papers, concept papers. And on the receiving end, again, we were lucky. There was another professor of international relations. Then, first Davutoğlu. First, he was advisor to Abdullah Gül, the president, and then he became Minister of Foreign Affairs, and then he became Prime Minister. So on the receiving end, we had him. And of course, a very bright and skillful diplomats. Turkish diplomatic corps is a very experienced body of practitioners. Anyway, so with that was a lucky, we were lucky to have that inertia going on in 2001 and then, but other than this intellectual exchanges, there were other initiatives for the institutionalization of this particular engagement. Turkey took initiatives in international organizations to start different contact groups. Friends of Mediation at the UN, again, another mediation contact group at OSCE, with Finland and Switzerland. I think they are rotating chairs. Another one was established in Organization of Islamic Cooperation, where mediation certificate programs are being launched for young junior diplomats. So that is one part of the genealogy of this practice. Of course, there are some other factors as well. Maybe we'll get into that later in the panel. But in a nutshell, I have a list of mediation efforts since 2001 till now. We see almost a mediation hyperactivity in different regions, in different cases, and in different continents. And the knowledge and institutionalization is with the Turkish practitioners. And I think it has been a smart move for Turkey to adapt, to own this particular engagement in its foreign policy. Again, maybe we will discuss later why. Thank you.
Thank you, Nimet. And thank you also for underscoring that distinction between a governing party as mediator versus a state as mediator. I think this is one of the questions we're really grappling with in this new landscape is if the conflict parties are looking at their mediator and it is not a disinterested or representative foreign body, but instead a state, I think they're reasonable in asking, are we being mediated by the state of X country, or are we being mediated by the government or administration of X country? And part of the reason we know that's important is because increasingly we also see an expectation that the body or individual that's mediating either themselves become a guarantor to whatever is agreed, or at a minimum are prepared to help set up a cast of guarantors to support the viability of what's negotiated. Cecily, as an analyst based here in Washington, how do you see this phenomenon of emergent mediation powers, and what do you make of the implications for policymakers?
Thanks, and thanks to all the panelists today. It's wonderful to hear perspectives from outside of Washington today, so that's great. I do have a disclaimer like Andrea's, just that the views that I speak today are mine and do not represent the U.S. government. But yeah, I wanted to take just a step back, and we've heard the perspectives from the individual countries, South Africa, Oman, Turkey, and I wanted to put it in the global landscape just quickly. We've talked about, Yusuf said very articulately, how there's more conflict today. When I started my conflict career and in graduate school, we were looking very much at intrastate conflicts, civil wars, fragile states, and then later non-state actors in conflict, namely terrorism. And clearly today, state-based conflict is back on the agenda. And in fact, it's never gone away. As many of you know, there have long been state-to-state conflicts, but now it's at its highest points in the 1990s. So to sum up what I think you've heard reflected in all the comments, that the conflict landscape is really changing, and particularly the state-based nature of it. And then even where we have internal conflicts like civil war in Sudan, for example, in Yemen, many other cases, you're seeing internationalized civil wars with external actors supporting parties to internal conflicts. And in the case of Yemen, I'd say that even something that started as an internalized conflict within Yemen was then external actors came in to support those internal parties, and now obviously the Houthis, the internal party, are now waging a global conflict, attacking global shipping lanes. So I would really posit that the nature of conflict is changing, and I think that we as mediators in the conflict world are trying to keep up with this, to catch up with this change, and particularly for state-based mediators with the change in conflict, it matters. There's certainly more actors, more diverse set of actors, and then the coordination challenges that Sasha spoke very articulately to with the UN role shifting. So in this comes lots of opportunities. I think those were represented really well today. The different styles can match the type of conflict that's happening and what the parties are looking for in a mediator. There's different sources of leverage. I've seen that in my career. I can get into that in a second. And then there's more actors to work on more conflicts. As there's more conflict, we're going to need more mediators. But there are also challenges, and I thought Sasha covered this really well, so I won't go into detail, but particularly the coordination challenges among different pieces of a mediation. How do we create an overarching structure and that they all work together? Just quickly, I'll take Sudan as a case in point on this. The 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement that was signed, which basically launched the road that led to eventually to Sudan's independence, was facilitated by the regional body IGAD and then supported by a troika of the US, UK, and Norway. So very classic, traditional mediation partners supporting a regional entity. Sasha said, well, in Africa, or maybe it was Andrea, in Africa we've often had these outside supporters of a regional mediation process. But then in the post-independence period, 2011, 2012 timeframe, the African Union was the facilitator of talks between Sudan and South Sudan then. And again, you had the Troika in support and a group of friends of Sudan in support. But you also saw someone like the US Special Envoy to Sudan at the time, Princeton Lyman, I was lucky enough to get to work with. He would call his Chinese counterpart fairly frequently, and sort of, this is outside the formal mediation process, they would each talk about how the US had leverage on the South Sudanese, and the Sudanese, because of particularly their economic oil interests, had leverage on the Sudanese. And so you'd see this sort of working of leverage behind the scenes outside of the formal mediation process. And so I think that's an example of the opportunity that comes when you have more actors in the facilitation mediation space, you have more opportunities to apply leverage. And then maybe if we fast forward to April 2023, with the outbreak again of violence in Sudan, you see, I think, some of the real challenges, not to disparage the mediation process in what's been an extremely complex and difficult conflict, but I think you see the state-based nature of that conflict changing very close to when the conflict started, external actors providing support to the warring parties. Some of those, and states involved in general. So some states are providing support to the belligerents. Others want to be involved in the mediation process, and there's a negotiation about the mediation, right, which gets complicated. And then there's some actors doing both or wanting to do both at the same time, both providing support and wanting to be on the mediation. So we've had talks in Jeddah, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Egypt, Bahrain, back to Jeddah, and then Geneva. I mean, not that all, the talks or a variety of talks is necessarily bad, as Sasha talked about with the Ukraine process. They're addressing different parts of the conflict, but certainly there's a challenge there in the coordination and how you orchestrate that and who orchestrates it and how everyone talks together. And the data backs it up. We've seen in the past 20 years a threefold increase in the number of mediators and state-based actors working in the Sudan space, so certainly an increase. So just really quickly, why are these changes happening? And I think it comes back to something Nimet spoke about, and on the Oman case too, really powerfully, that it's a lot of times it's the shift in the geopolitical landscape that's driving this, both that there's more state-centric conflict and state actors are more involved in conflict, particular regional jockeying for power, but also it's a response of these countries to the shifts in the global power dynamics. For many countries, it's a way to navigate this increasing tension between different power centers. So just to kind of break that down a little bit, we're seeing the UN play less of the coordination role it used to play. So even in the Sudan example, there's a US Secretary General has a personal envoy, but he's in an observer role, not in the lead orchestrator role that we would have seen in the past. The shift on the US Western side, I think, is coming from the fact that there's more conflict, so there's more demand, and there's really then a desire to prioritize or to use hybrid models. And perhaps we saw in the DRC Rwanda case jump in a really tense moment, in this case right before the DRC election, kind of supercharge a mediation dialogue process and then hand it back, in this case back to the Angolans, the Luanda process and have them take it back over. So I think we're seeing a hybrid, innovative, new models as the traditional, what we call the traditional mediators, are trying to deal with this changing conflict and just the increase in demand on their time. And then, as I talked about before, I think we're seeing a recognition from the traditional mediators that they really benefit from pulling in other actors, particularly in cases like Iran. The U.S., I think, has long been aware and has really leaned on its Middle Eastern partners to be an interlocutor, a credible voice to talk to the Iranians when some kind of dialogue is needed. And then there's, I think, a shift in demand. A lot of the countries that are facing conflict are looking to non-Western mediators, and that's certainly part of the equation. And then just really quickly to wrap up, I think some of the most interesting shifts we're seeing, which Nimet highlighted as well, are on the emerging power side. So the mediators like Turkey, Oman, Qatar, who've long been in the mediation space, but I think are now even more proactively putting themselves into that space. And it's a lot, as I said, in this response to shifting geopolitical terrain. I'll just give one example. So in the Russia, U.S., European prisoner exchange case, right, Turkey can proactively lean forward and kind of sell itself, be present as an honest broker, which helps them not only because it's needed, and so the parties look to them, but also it allows them to become indispensable to both power centers. And so in a context where often they could be criticized and have been criticized by both parties for not picking a side, the proactive mediation space allows them to be indispensable to both sides and kind of is a way of dealing with the current international conflict. So I will leave it there, and we can get into kind of what this means for policymakers in terms of solutions as we go forward.
Thank you so much, and especially for highlighting that relationship between emerging mediation powers and the changing landscape of multipolarity as well. I also love Sudan as a very revealing case study of this conversation. It's sort of like looking at the cross-section of a tree trunk, and you see the rings that represent each chapter of the trajectory as the international community tries to find new ways to approach intractable problems. Our next phase of this is we have a few questions that are panelist-specific that I'll direct to individual panelists, and then we'll progress into a sort of more open-ended exchange with whatever time we have left. My first question is for you, Youssef. Oman has the distinction of being in a neighborhood that has a lot of other emerging or maybe aspiring mediation powers. And I was fascinated by the sort of three principles that you articulated of how Oman thinks about approaching mediation. And I was hoping you could help us understand how this approach might differ somewhat from the approach undertaken by Qatar or other states in the Gulf.
Thank you. I think it's a very excellent question, and I think, in this matter, first of all, to dive into understanding the principle which we are really laying off. And as I mentioned, the first one, we do believe on the full inclusivity during any conflict resolution process, which we mean, at that particular moment when there is a design over the negotiation table is happening, we don't exclude despite whoever is designated, nominated, so we do make sure to have everyone across the table, despite how those are seen either from the international community or on the regional power. So we do make sure everyone should be there, and not limiting ourselves to design the negotiation table that is really enabling our ability to call up anyone to that table and make sure the result would be more welcomed and more committed. Because one really important part we are bearing in mind while we are negotiating, that the enforceability of the result of this negotiation are very limited. End of the day, there is some sort of endorsement should happen either from the UN or from any of the international big powers. And in the absence of that, the minimum enforceability we can ensure it is through the commitment of having different parties, even those who are, the rest of international community are not speaking to having them on the table. That's recognized, that recognition to them is getting us the commitment to deliver on the deal they are getting to. The other principle, I think, which we mentioned, the outcome, it's very important to tackle the point of outcome because, there is no assurance of whatever outcome, and that's coming from two different direction to the mentality. Where one, it is purely from the Islamic religion, where the mediation process in the Islam, it should guarantee the implementation of the mediation. Otherwise, the mediator would have a role to stand against the power who really did not commit to the deal. And that sort of responsibility, it's very huge to take, especially in a very dynamic and as well in the middle of conflict. The second thing is the same point which I just mentioned, the implementation or the impossibility of implementation of these deals are very difficult. Just the last point I want to mention here, that the GCC, it's very interesting. Almost all countries in the GCC, they are taking different role toward mediation and in different topics. So we are seeing, for example, Kuwait getting very active in the intra-GCC misunderstanding and conflict. We are seeing Oman is really active into anything related to Iran, GCC, so on and so forth. We are seeing as well Qatar is getting its own space. We are seeing UAE, we are seeing Saudi, we are seeing even Bahrain. And what I want to say here that these different roles, it's as well providing different models. There are certain models which is coming with a really a very loud, very open, giving as well a very huge brief in the media. There are others which are more discreet. So, and all of these different models are complementing each other and providing different variety of mediation models. Those are not competing against each other.
Thank you so much, Youssef. And it's really interesting to hear your response to that following Cecily's remarks, because one of the things I heard from Cecily was we need more mediation actors in this space to rise to the volume of conflicts we need to address. And naturally, some burden sharing is going to need to emerge from this. And so it's really interesting to hear from you how within the GCC countries, there's sort of portfolios emerging that, to your point, reflect specific approaches or preferences. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn to Andrea now. One of the trends we've been tracking with South Africa's mediation style is how heavily it draws on its own experience coming out of conflict and the post-apartheid transition in its mediation. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit to how South Africa's recent history influences how it approaches or engages in mediation.
Thank you, Sasha. That's a great question. Yes, so South Africa's mediation style, very broadly, I'd say, is based on its history, based on two sort of principles: local ownership and compromise. The latter of which is a bit politically sensitive, but it worked for South Africa at the time. Maybe just to take you back very quickly, before the actual negotiations took place in South Africa, various members of the liberation movement, and specifically the African National Congress at the time, went around the African continent expressing their interests and what they wanted the negotiation process to look like. And in doing so, they managed to sort of garner some support and African broadly speaking, consensus around what the process should look like. This culminated in a meeting that was held in Zimbabwe, which eventually led to the adoption of a declaration known as the Harare Declaration that captured the interests and the positions of the African National Congress at the time. It was then endorsed by the Organization of African Unity, which is today the African Union, and then endorsed by the United Nations. So I'm hoping that you're getting a bit of a picture in your head about how this homegrown solution emerged instead of a top-down approach. And what we see, interestingly, is a party to a conflict actually directing the path that the negotiations would eventually take. So it was internally driven and focused on local ownership. I think before I go on to compromise, what's also important to note is when the negotiations happened, they happened in South Africa. So it wasn't happening in a host state that might ordinarily have a bit more influence over the pace and the logistics, which can affect the overall outcome. In terms of compromise, I'd like to maybe take you to an interview that our former president Thabo Mbeki did with Al Jazeera a few years back. And he spoke about how if at the time of negotiations there was an arrest warrant for F.W. de Klerk, who was on the opposing side, by the ICC or the international community, the ANC and the group of negotiators on the liberation movement side would not have fully supported this. They would not have welcomed such an arrest warrant. And this was because they needed de Klerk present, they needed him in order to see this peaceful transition through, because he had a constituency behind him which would eventually be involved in running the government after the agreement was signed. So this issue of compromise is key to also how South Africa pursues negotiations with certain personalities or leaders who might not be seen favorably in the international community. For example, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, Charles Taylor in Liberia, Gaddafi in Libya. But the position has always been that, in order to make peace, you can't just talk to your friends. So sometimes this has been a bit of an unpopular approach, depending on who you're talking to, but certainly one that worked for South Africa at the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it was great to be reminded of the ANC's sort of consensus building tour across the continent, because 3 decades later, that really rhymes with actually what we see Ukraine undertaking with its peace summits and its efforts to build consensus around its 10-point plan. So it's an interesting model that's come back to the fore. Nimet, I'd like to turn to you now. One of the things we heard from a lot of the emerging mediation powers that we spoke with over our travels was an interest in being able to pivot from a regional portfolio of mediation to engaging further afield with conflicts further afield, and the challenges that these mediation powers were facing in making that shift. And to my mind, Turkey has already made that transition, and drawing on its long history of mediating in the Horn of Africa. In recent years, we've seen them engaged in brokering deals in Libya, in the Middle East, in Nagorno-Karabakh. So they actually already have a fairly global, or at least a wider portfolio geographically in terms of where they're engaging in mediation. To what do you attribute that?
Well, thank you for the question. I think there are multiple reasons for that, as always. First of all, we need to look at the Turkey's identity. If countries have an identity, that's also a little bit. So Turkey is a NATO member. It is a Muslim-populated country. It's a secular country. According to its constitution, is a democratic country. And it has strong ties with the West, with the Western institutions, transatlantic institutions, with the EU. So this, in a way, with these features, it has a hybrid identity in the region, in the sense that, plus, unlike Gulf countries, Turkey is not sitting on natural resources. So with these, I think Turkey had to find a way to generate some power, some relational power through the help of peacemaking activities. So that, as a principle, helped Turkey to look around and be proactive in designing its foreign policy actions. But another characteristic is, which I forgot, is Turkey has an imperial past. So Ottoman Empire for 600 years ruled 3 continents. So Turkey, in a way, with all these characteristics, is able to position itself, as Cecily mentioned, in this new, in this new shifting landscape of international politics. She is able to position itself as the sole link to some network powers. Sometimes she plays that card as the NATO member card. Works in some kinds of conflicts. Sometimes being I shouldn't say Muslim country, but a country with Muslim population, that helps if they want to come up with some religious leadership type of a when they want to use that card. And in Africa, what I see is that not having a colonial past is a plus for Turkey, and that rhetoric is heavily used there, almost also kind of sometimes accusing the others being profit-oriented, for example. That goes to China and China's activities in Africa, or being neo-colonial in Africa, the former colonial, that goes to former colonial powers. So there are different rhetorics which can be used in different cases. Plus, I should also say that, as in my opening remarks, I mentioned there is a deep experience and knowledge accumulation there. So with Turkey is able to, I see it as Swiss Army knife. If there's depending on the stages of conflict, depending on the region, and some different types of peaceful third-party engagements, she can take, different roles. ranging from facilitation, communication, to aid, to development initiatives. And she does this with multiple institutions, not only with the State Department, the intelligence, and the aid and development agencies. They are all very equipped with this particular, skill. And this kind of culminates into a whole in its foreign policy making adventure. So it's a very well designed, to my taste, and orchestrated thing. So, but of course, it is not easy to manage. We are talking about multiple, shifting variables there. It has to be conducted very carefully, not to offend traditional partners, and not to be also to preserve the credibility in international affairs. So it's not an easy task, but I think what she's trying to do is that. And, based on your observations, to some extent, I think she's been successful doing that because, again, she's in multiple geographies mediating. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nimet. And thank you also for pointing out that as non-Western mediating powers institutionalize their mediation capability, that they are doing so with a lot more institutional diversity than we might traditionally see in the West, where mediation has long been seen as the domain of diplomats and foreign ministries and state departments. And we arguably see a lot more, or maybe I'll just say a lot more explicit participation by intelligence agencies, ministries of defense, royal palaces, and so forth. And it gives a different flavor to these engagements. I realize we are probably in our final stretch here, so I want to bring us to one last question that will be open to any panelists to weigh on, which is a thread that's been running through many of your comments. I'll frame it as follows. It's no secret that any state mediator is unlikely to broker or facilitate a compromise that is inconsistent with their own national interests, which is maybe an overly delicate way of saying that it is natural that mediation is going to be enmeshed at some level with a state's foreign policy. And I think this manifests quite differently in the context that we've been discussing today. I know that South Africa has historically used its leadership on peace and security issues as, among other things, a space to punch above its weight in the larger international geopolitical scene. I heard Youssef say also, very interestingly, that sometimes mediation is a matter of security. It's almost a direct imperative for Oman to sometimes be engaged in these mediation activities. So I'd love to open it up to any panelists to weigh in on how they see this relationship between mediation as an instrument or an undertaking relate to foreign policy.
Can I? Well, when we think about mediation, generally, this will be a little bit a scholarly observation, but we take the mediation theory as our reference point, which says, there are some factors affecting the mediation outcome. The antecedents of that, generally they are the context factors, are about the identity of the mediator, about the context in which this mediation takes place, the nature of the disputes, etc. Then we switched to the process factor about the style of the mediator, whether it's a facilitation, whether it's and then we try to understand what happens at the end. So that is a very typical framework that we operate in. And that is to say we borrowed that template from behavioral sciences, by the way. So it was not derived from IR scholars. But that serves a lot because it gives a contour to understand mediation as an analyst, as a researcher, as a practitioner as well. But at the same time, it limits our understanding in the way that we isolate mediations, we compartmentalize this particular interaction within these limits. So with your question, how this connects to foreign policy, so there is another now approach which says that we have to look to mediation as not in terms of just these components, antecedents, processes, and outcomes, but at the same time, we should look what mediation does, what kind of power configurations it generates in the wider political landscape. So this is another type of looking at things, and it requires to look at a larger machinery in which mediation works and what that constellation of interactions produce. So with that, I think that would be a conceptual link, at least for me, how mediation and foreign policy could interact in practice. Especially if I go back to Turkey, as I said, Turkey doesn't have natural sources to offer to the mediators as perks at the end of the agreement, or use it as rewards. So without having that type of resources, Turkey and generally middle powers in its with those kinds of qualifications, they need to find out some extra sources of power. That's why I refer to relational power or positional power, and that is almost you have to do that. Plus, so it should be part and parcel of your foreign policy. Plus, of course, practically speaking, you are in the region while mediating, then some other connections arise. Maybe that turns into bilateral relations. That's another type of benefit. But at the same time, foreign, it is part and parcel of foreign policy making of middle powers. I mean, it's inevitable if they want to generate some leverage in international politics. Also, they have to, there is a perception that the global dynamics are shifting in that part of the world. And with that, they want to be a player, a proactive actors to be on the right side, or they are very careful not to put their eggs in one basket only, and they distribute their roles and activities. But at the same time, they are trying to be the designer of the future architect. So with all those things in mind, if you take all that into consideration, mediation is one of the instruments, along with, of course, classical instruments of foreign policy execution, like economic, intelligence, military, and so on.
Thank you so much, Nimet. Did any of the other panelists want to come in on this question of foreign policy enmeshment?
Just quickly, since I promised a few practical applications of the analysis, I wanted to make sure. So for policymakers in the foreign policy space, this is how it connects to your question, I would say the key is not to get sort of stuck in, for technical term, stuck in kind of looking back at how things used to be, right, where the UN played this strong coordination role, and really see this as much as possible an opportunity for innovation. And then we can spend a whole nother panel talking about technology, but there's a couple places. I was really struck by Andrea's point that particularly the South Africa mediation took place within South Africa. It wasn't that model of flying the actors to a foreign country. And I think with technology, we're going to see more and more that even the latest Sudan talks in Switzerland, they were linking back to actors on the ground in Sudan who were giving them real-time information on the humanitarian space. So I think we're going to start to see this more diffuse sort of form of negotiation and mediation, and that brings with it a lot of opportunities. Another place technology is very, very helpful is in mapping actors in the conflict, but also in the mediation space. As I discussed, the state-based actors, and we just talked about it in the foreign policy, they're bringing their own interests and their own vision of how things turn out. And traditionally, that analysis has been done in diplomats' heads and analysis heads in the intel community. But now we have technology as a tool that can lay out this landscape and map it for us. And the computer's not going to give you the answer. It's still the diplomat that's going to come up with the answer. But I think that interaction between the sort of cold hard data that, of course, humans fed into, how will actors react to this form of negotiation proposal versus this form, that sort of back and forth dialogue, the brainstorming that happens in that space will be really helpful going forward as we're seeing more and more actors in mediation. Another is, the sort of, we've relied for a long time on the UN and things like arms embargoes. And so it's very frustrating, obviously, to many of us that mechanism in the Security Council is no longer working the way it used to, the way it should. But mediators, there's nothing stopping mediators from getting together a group of them and saying you can only be part of this public mediation effort if you're not supplying arms to an active party in conflict. So all to say, mediators are just going to have to, I think, be more innovative in how they're responding to this space, kind of creating new mechanisms to fill in for ones that they used to rely on. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Cecily. I can see we've come up on time, so just to round us out to a close, I wanted to put my finger on a couple threads that I heard here, which I think are particularly salient for a Washington-based audience. And one thread running throughout is this concept of inclusion, and I think that is a principle that is articulated with enthusiasm by Western-based mediation powers, but sometimes as a shorthand to mean something different than the way we hear actors from other parts of the world speaking about it. So we heard USIP refer to inclusion as sort of no man left behind, right? That the mediator won't put their thumb on the scale in terms of who's allowed at the table and who is not. We heard Andrea talk about local ownership, and South Africa's model has also long been heralded as putting a lot of emphasis on civil society participation. And the UN itself has its own definitions of what inclusion means in their understanding of process design. So I think this is something that deserves its own panel at some point in the future to unpack. And then I'd also just like to underscore Nimet's point on the role of identity in social psychology, because a message we heard from a lot of mediation powers was essentially, we are good at this in a way that Western powers are not, because we understand how this culture thinks about conflict, not just understands what the issues are in more detail than Western actors do, but we understand how they understand it and how that manifests and how they communicate and how they understand compromise. And I think that's their rather polite way of reminding us that Western-led mediations have maybe not always been sufficiently mindful or sufficiently curious about how those dynamics come to play in a mediation. I'll just close by saying I think 2025 is shaping up to be a year with a lot more interesting dynamics in this regard and a lot of mediations to watch. So we'll all be in standby to track how this live issue unfolds. But I'd just like to invite everyone to give a big round of applause to our panelists. And we appreciate all of you for coming out and listening to this discussion, and look forward to continuing it with all of you in different fora.
Thank you for listening to this event. If you'd like to listen to more events or explore our other podcasts, visit usip.org/podcasts.